For each phase of flight, here's how flying a turboprop compares to flying a piston aircraft. I'm Charlie, and I recently got checked out in the Kodiak 100, which is a 10-seat, 750 horsepower, turbine-powered Bush aircraft. It is an absolute blast. The first thing you'll notice in the cockpit is that there are new levers to get used to, and there are also some new engine instruments to become aware of and familiar with. So we'll cover each of those, and then I'll cover each phase of flight to explain practically what's different versus a piston. First, you'll notice that the throttle quadrant looks a little different than in your piston aircraft. You have the fuel condition lever on the right, the prop, throttle, and then the emergency power lever, or EPL. The two on the outside, the fuel condition lever and the EPL, those are new, so let's look at those first. The fuel condition lever is kind of like the mixture in a piston where it's controlling your fuel cutoff, but the big difference is you aren't going to be leaning it mid-flight like you would be in a piston. You're mainly using it for cutoff, low idle, and then high idle, which I'll explain here in a minute. It's kind of like setting the minimum amount of fuel the engine is getting. Now, engineers are probably gonna hate this analogy, but it's been memorable for me, so stick with me. I kind of think about the fuel condition lever sort of like a lawnmower or a leaf blower. If you've ever noticed, sometimes they have a little lever on there that has a turtle on one end and a rabbit on the other, slow and fast. And as you adjust that lever, it's kind of adjusting the minimum throttle or the minimum idle speed of that engine. And so as you release the throttle, it's only going to go down to the minimum that you have set on that lever. The fuel condition lever is kind of similar. So when you're taxiing around in low idle, and then a lot of times the checklist will call for when you're going onto the runway to move it into high idle, you'll notice the engine spool up. And so that's kind of the new minimum threshold because you've adjusted the fuel condition lever. So that's kind of how I think about it. Then you also have a new lever called the EPL, or emergency power lever. Your primary throttle lever uses kind of a hybrid mechanical and pneumatic system, like air system, to regulate the amount of fuel that goes to the engine and controls the power. Now, if that pneumatic system fails, the engine will roll back to idle or something near idle. It's called a rollback. And you can use the EPL instead to manually adjust the throttle because your normal power lever doesn't work in that instance. But the EPL is way more sensitive than your normal power lever. Now, mostly this lever just sits here though, and it's only used in an emergency, but I did want to explain it. So now remaining are the throttle lever and your prop control. Now these will be familiar controls if you've ever flown a constant speed propeller airplane before, like a Cessna 182 or something like that. However, there are some new gauges to reference for these controls, such as torque, ITT, NP, and NG. So let's cover each of these instruments. So in a fixed pitch propeller, you just have a tachometer showing you RPMs. And then in a constant speed propeller aircraft, you have manifold pressure and a tachometer. Well, in the turbine, there's a little bit more. You still have a gauge showing you propeller RPMs, but it's now instead labeled NP. And manifold pressure is more or less replaced with torque and ITT, but then you also have %NG in there. So what the heck do all of those mean? Well, luckily they aren't as complicated as they sound. Let's walk through each of them, starting with torque. So torque is measured and displayed in foot-pounds, which is kind of a weird concept, but if you imagine a 1 foot long lever and you put 1 pound of pressure on the end of that lever, the resulting twisting motion is 1 foot-pound of torque. Now, if you applied 2 pounds of pressure on the end of that 1 foot lever, that would be 2 foot-pounds of torque, 1 times 2. Now, if you made the lever 2 feet long instead of 1 foot long, and you applied that same 2 pounds of pressure, you now have 4 foot-pounds of torque. It's basically just a combined measure of force and leverage. So as you're adjusting the power lever, one of the things that's going to move on your engine instruments is torque. Torque is kind of your primary power selection tool. Now you can use this for power settings similar to how you would manifold pressure on an approach. For example, when you're in the pattern, 600 pounds of torque for the Kodiak will keep you nice and level going in the pattern. And then as you're descending, 450 pounds or so usually puts you right on the glide path. And so you can use it to peg your power settings. You also want to make sure you don't over torque the engine, which we'll talk about here in a minute, but that's torque. Next is ITT, which is inner turbine temperature. It's basically the combustion gas temperature of the engine, or how hot is the engine running. It's not really your primary power indication, but it's something you're referencing for power settings to make sure you don't over temp the engine. In general, down low, you'll usually hit your torque limitation before you hit your temperature limitation. But up high, the opposite is true. You'll usually reach your temperature limitation before a torque limitation. And so this would be called, temping out before you torque out, or I'm temperature limited, or I'm torque limited. Next is NP, which gives you propeller RPMs. If you've flown a constant speed propeller before, you'll be familiar with this concept. Basically, once you give it enough throttle, the propeller governor will kick in and it'll end up capping or limiting the propeller RPMs just by controlling the angle of the propeller blade. It's pretty cool. So at that point, you can instead control RPMs with the prop control lever. Now this might sound more confusing than it is. I promise once you get used to it, it's really intuitive. Now I did an entire video just dedicated to flying a constant speed propeller. So if it's a new concept for you or you need a refresher, I'll put a link to that video down in the description. And finally, NG is your gas generator speed, which references the rotation speed of the compressor section of the engine. Now this one's a little bit different than the other three engine instruments we just covered because this one isn't actually a fixed number, it's actually displayed as a percentage, and it's a percentage of the design maximum. So for example, in the Kodiak, 100% NG represents 37,500 RPMs. It's spinning really fast. So if they were to show this gauge as 36,000 RPMs out of 37,500 RPMs, one, that's a lot of numbers to show on there, and two, that would be kind of tough computing for the pilot. So instead, it just shows it as a percentage, so percent NG. Now you don't really use percentage NG to peg power settings like you might with torque, like I was discussing earlier on an approach. However, where NG becomes really important is when you lose engine power. So if all of a sudden you lose engine power, that becomes your first scan looking at NG, because if it stabilizes around some sort of idle, that just tells you you had a rollback. So you have a problem with your throttle. Like I talked about earlier, that's where the EPL or emergency power lever comes in. But if it continues to go down and down to zero, you know you lost the engine entirely. So that's where it's a really helpful indication. The other time you end up using it is on engine startup, where once it's hit a minimum threshold, that's when you can add fuel in the starting process. And then once it's achieved a certain limit, that's when you can actually disengage the starter, which I'll cover here in just a second. Now, if all of that sounds really overwhelming, I promise it gets easier after just a few flights. You'll definitely get the hang of it. And practically speaking, there's not a whole lot going on. You're mainly just using torque as your primary power indication, also minding ITT to not overtemp the engine. And then your prop, you're really only moving it, as I'll discuss here in a second, after takeoff and then right before landing. And other than that, it's honestly pretty simple. So you'll get used to it. Don't be intimidated. Now that we've got a lay of the land, that brings us to the engine start, which is a lot different than in a piston. In a piston, you're priming it and starting it and waiting for the engine to turn over and roar to life. And sometimes it can be a little temperamental, as you probably know, where you're trying to find the right balance of fuel to give it, and it might take several tries to get it just right. But in a turbine, it's different because there isn't an engine turnover moment, but instead it's actually happening gradually and slowly coming to life. And as a result, it's actually a lot easier. An instructor described it to me this way: in a piston, there's a lot to do, but not a lot to watch or monitor. But in a turboprop, there's not a lot to do, but there is a lot to watch and monitor. So let me explain. So in a turbine, at least in the Kodiak, you turn on the auxiliary fuel pump and the igniters, which kind of sound like the igniters of a gas stove or gas grill. They're going click, click, click. And then next you engage the starter, and it's going to start spinning up the engine and slowly turning the prop. At that point, you're watching NG start to climb because that compressor section is spooling up. And once you've achieved 14% NG, there's enough air flowing through the engine that igniting fuel isn't going to overtemp it. But if you add fuel before this point, you could end up with a hot start, which could really damage the engine. So once you're at or above 14% NG, you then take the fuel condition lever, which is kind of like the mixture in a piston, and you set it to low idle. And then if you listen for it, there's a really cool sound in the engine where you can hear it starting to introduce and ignite fuel. It's kind of a puff sound. And now that fuel has been introduced, you keep the starter engaged because the engine is still spooling up. At this point, ITT will be climbing because you've ignited the engine and fuel is being burned, but the engine is still spooling up and it's giving it progressively more cooling air. So you'll want to monitor ITT to make sure that you don't have a hot start where it's exceeding temperature limitations. And then you're also continuing to monitor percent NG like you were at the beginning of the start to ensure that it's continuing to start up and spool up. Now, if it doesn't and it stalls at a certain number, you then have a hung start where the engine isn't fully starting. Now, in either case, a hot start or a hung start, you'd cut the fuel and abort the starting process. But assuming everything is looking healthy and normal, in the Kodiak, once you get to 52% NG, you can disengage the starter and the engine is now running on its own. So there's not a lot to do really, but there is a lot to watch. The great thing is that it is really simple and it's way less temperamental than starting a piston. And nothing sounds cooler than that turbine engine slowly spooling up and the prop starting to turn faster and faster and fuel getting introduced, and you can just hear this beast coming to life. It's just awesome. But in case that sounded like a lot, I promise that it's far easier than it sounds. So I want to show a clip from a real life startup sequence here without my commentary. So hopefully you can see there's actually not a whole lot to it.
Okay, ready if you are. Okay, ready. Okay.
Taxiing isn't much different except for the fact that you have forward, beta, and reverse thrust. Beta is basically just in between forward and reverse, where the propeller blade angle is effectively not generating any forward or reverse thrust. And so you can kind of use it instead of light braking. Now it makes a very noticeable sound when you're taxiing around. I don't know why, I just can't get enough of that. I think it's awesome. So if you hear a turbine taxiing around and all of a sudden it goes from the to that's beta. One of the great things about flying a turboprop is that once the engine is started, there are way less checks to do than in a piston. There's no magnetos to check, no carb heat, that sort of thing. And so there's not really much of a run up. There are obviously some pre-takeoff checks and stuff, but it's way more efficient. And that's partly because once the engine is running, as long as it has fuel, it's probably gonna keep running. It's kind of like a gas grill or a gas stove where you need help lighting it, but once it's lit, you can kind of turn the igniter off and just keep giving it fuel and it'll stay lit. Now it can flame out in heavy rain or ice and stuff, in which case you might want to fly around with the igniters on so that way it can relight itself if it experiences a flame out, but generally speaking, it's pretty simple. All of that to say, your pre-takeoff checks are pretty simple and you are ready for takeoff pretty quickly after startup. Some control towers might even expect or anticipate that you're gonna be ready once reaching the runway, and so that takes some getting used to. So obviously never be rushed by a controller, but that was a little bit of adjustment. Like my routine of flying a piston is you start up, you get the weather, you taxi down, and you're just planning on, let me find my little corner of the run-up area so I can just take a breath and do the run-up checks and all that and take as much time as I need. Turboprop, it's a little bit different, and so that just takes a little bit getting used to. And you're also burning a lot of fuel just sitting on the ground, way more than you would be in a piston, so you are trying to limit the amount of ramp time you have as well. On takeoff, everything is pretty much the same as a piston, except you have to be careful not to over-torque or over-temp the engine. You can't just firewall the throttle like I'm used to on my 182 and just give it all it's got. Now, I think some turbine engines might have torque limiters on it where this might not be the case. Now, if you have experience with that, please leave me a comment so I can learn from you. But at least in the Kodiak, it's kind of a balance between advancing the throttle quickly enough so you don't eat up a bunch of the runway, but also not giving it too much throttle and over-torquing or over-temping it. After takeoff, the climb out is really easy. In the Kodiak, we just adjust the propeller from 2200 RPMs down to 2000 RPMs using that prop lever, and then you basically just leave it there until you're on final for landing. So the rest of the way, you're really only using the power lever. It is really simple. And once you get to cruise, there's really not much to do other than selecting your power setting between torque and ITT based on the performance and the fuel burn you want. Just keep in mind though, once you're up high, you'll probably reach your ITT limitation before reaching a torque limitation. Like we discussed earlier, this is where you might temp out before you torque out, or say that you're temperature limited on how hard you can push the engine. But that's a lot easier than it might sound. You're basically just deciding how hard do I want to push the engine. And then to make things even more simple, there's no leaning or cow flaps or anything like that that you're used to in the piston. Again, you're really only touching the power lever the rest of the way until you're on final. Once you're in the descent or the approach, there are two awesome parts of flying a turboprop. The first is that you don't have to worry about shock cooling the engine. So you can go from full bore to full idle and the engine doesn't care. And the other thing is that you have a ton of drag, at least in the Kodiak, if and when you need it, because once you pull the power back, the prop governor is also changing the blade angle to a really shallow bite to maintain your high RPMs. And so the combined effect is both very little thrust and a ton of drag. And so you can really slow down in a hurry. Before we get to the landing, a quick stat you might appreciate is that I've been tracking it lately, and for every 1 minute of Airplane Academy content or the video, it easily takes 1 to 2 hours of time to produce it between the planning, the filming, the editing, etc. So a 15-minute video, for example, could easily take 30 hours to produce. So if you have found this helpful or you enjoy it, would you mind considering just hitting like or even subscribe to the channel? That's the best way you can just give me a virtual fist bump, and I'd really appreciate it. But if you don't like the video, don't do anything. Just keep watching. Landing a turboprop, in my opinion, takes a little more finesse than in a piston. I've noticed you kind of have to find the right power setting where you don't have too much drag, but you obviously don't have too much thrust either. When you pull the engine to idle, you obviously lose thrust, but you're also gaining a lot of drag, probably a lot more than you're used to in a piston. And so if you go to idle at any point in the approach, you're going to notice a ton of drag. But it's kind of a fun challenge to get that power setting just right. And then when you flare, I personally have noticed a lot more left turning tendency in the Kodiak than in my 182. I think it just has a lot more P factor pulling it to the left there. And so it has taken me a lot of landings to figure out how to anticipate that and not continually land left of center line. But it's still something I'm getting used to. And then once you touch down, you get to do something really fun that you don't get to in a piston, and that's putting the prop into either beta or even reverse. And this helps you with your ground roll because you're no longer producing any forward thrust. Now, reverse thrust is cool. It sounds really cool. By the book, in the Kodiak, it only decreases your ground roll by like 5%. So it's nothing crazy, and it can kick up a lot of dirt and stuff that could get inhaled by the engine. So for those reasons, you might not use actual reverse thrust as much as you think, but it sure is fun to use it. But you're definitely still using beta in every single landing. It's a no-brainer just to remove that forward thrust vector. Once you land and you're taxiing to the ramp and you're thinking, hey, how much fuel do we need? One thing to get used to is that turboprop fuel is all in pounds. That's kind of annoying to get used to because I'm just used to being gallon-centric, but it's all in pounds. The quick way is just to divide the pounds by roughly 6.7, and that'll get you gallons. But if you don't have a phone handy with a calculator or something, there is a quick shorthand that is really useful. Let's say you need 1,000 pounds. Well, you can drop that last digit, which makes it 100, and then take half of that amount, so half of 100 is 50, and then add those two together. So 100 plus 50 is 150 gallons. Another example is, say you need 800 pounds. Well, you drop that last digit, which gives you 80, take half of that, half of 80 is 40, and add them together. 80 plus 40 is 120 gallons. It's not perfectly accurate, but it gets you pretty close. I'm putting together a separate video talking about the training that I went through to get checked out in the Kodiak because it was a blast, and I wanted to be able to share it with others. So once that's available, it'll be here on the screen. And until then, I put another video on the screen that I think you might enjoy. So either way, I'll see you there.
My wife is staring at me. What are you doing? I'm trying to teach people how to start a turbine.